Picture this. You're standing in the shadow of the pyramids, surrounded by what history books call an enlightened civilization. But beneath the gold and grandeur lies a dark secret. Sexual practices so disturbing, they were deliberately erased from temple walls. Why would a society we admire sanction acts that would horrify us today? Imagine stepping into the dimly lit inner chambers of a temple dedicated to Hathor, where the air is thick with incense and something far more unsettling. Here, sex wasn't considered sinful. It was sacred. But don't mistake this for some liberating ancient utopia. Records from Egyptian temples show that what started as fertility rites quickly transformed into something far darker. Wealthy patrons would arrive bearing gifts, not just offerings to the goddess, but payments for the priestesses. Temple ledgers list these transactions in careful detail, marking the exchange as sacred union, while tracking grain, gold, and linen changing hands. The spiritual veneer was paper thin. You'd think temple authorities would protect these women. Instead, they enforced quotas. Each priestess expected to service a set number of men per day under the guise of religious duty. Archaeological evidence suggests some tried to refuse, but temple contracts reveal punishments for those who didn't comply. This system didn't benefit the priestesses. It enriched both temple coffers and local elites. Men of influence gained divine justification for their desires, while the women had no real choice. Some historians argue it was simply institutionalized exploitation masked by elaborate rituals. The goddess Hathor herself was often invoked to legitimize this trade. Statues and hymns depict her as both nurturing mother and seductress, a deliberate contradiction that gave men religious cover for their demands. Yet no prayers survive from the priestesses forced into this service, just lists of compliance dutifully recorded by male scribes. What's most disturbing is how thoroughly this system permeated society. Young girls from impoverished families were sometimes handed over to temples as brides of the gods, condemning them to this life before they could possibly understand. Their bodies became currency in a divine bargain they never agreed to. Though painted as holy tradition, these rituals shared more with legalized trafficking than genuine worship. The silence in the records is deafening. Not one document preserves the voice of a priestess speaking freely about her experience. Their truth was buried along with their names. Ancient texts warn against the casual visitor entering these sacred spaces unprepared. Now we understand why, not because of some mystical power, but because the reality behind those temple walls was far uglier than the glittering facade suggested. The gods may have reaped praise, but only mortal men truly benefited. You're 15 years old, standing in the palace gardens with your sister. The priests have just announced your betrothal, though you've shared the same nursery since birth. This isn't love, it's royal duty. Pharaohs married sisters for centuries, mimicking the gods Osiris and Isis, who were both siblings and spouses. Modern genetic testing reveals the devastating consequences of this tradition. Royal mummies show evidence of severe inbreeding: cleft palates, club feet, and spinal deformities. Tutankhamun's DNA tells the clearest story. He was the product of generations of brother-sister unions, suffering from a club foot and likely needing a cane. His tomb contained 130 walking sticks. The royal nursery was a gallery of suffering. Stillborn infants were mummified with care, their tiny coffins hidden in palace storerooms. Surviving children often died young, their bodies racked with genetic disorders. A medical papyrus describes royal infants born with their hearts outside their rib cages, likely a real condition caused by generations of inbreeding. Yet temple carvings show these unions as glorious. A pharaoh and sister wife stand equal, their matching crowns symbolizing divine harmony. In reality, their children paid the price. Queens like Nefertiti, while famously beautiful, were likely products of this system. Her daughters would carry those same damaged genes. Court physicians knew the dangers. A papyrus advises royal couples to conceive only at certain times, suggesting some awareness of inherited conditions. But tradition prevailed over science. The god Horus married his sister Hathor. How could mortals do less? Examinations of royal mummies reveal multiple generations with the same rare genetic markers, proving how thoroughly the bloodline purified itself into fragility. Some kings had so many health issues they ruled from palanquins, never standing in public. Their sister wives fared worse. Many died in childbirth, their narrow hips ill-suited for babies with congenital defects. Temple texts praise these matches as keeping the royal blood pure as the Nile's source. They never mention the cribs that stood empty, or the children who couldn't walk. Foreign princesses brought new genes when captured in war, but their offspring were often excluded from succession. Only the defective products of incest qualified as truly royal. The system collapsed under its own weight. Later dynasties abandoned brother-sister marriage when rulers became too weak to govern. By then the damage was done. Multiple royal lines ended not with conquest but with sickly children who never reached adulthood. The gods' example had nearly destroyed their earthly representatives. Archaeologists now find tiny gold sandals in royal tombs, fitted for feet that never grew. These are the true legacy of the pharaoh's purity obsession. Not golden treasure or monumental temples, but silent witnesses to a dynasty that sacrificed its children at the altar of tradition. You watch the executioner raise his blade, relieved when justice is served, until he drops his weapon and moves toward the body instead. This was the unspoken rule in some Egyptian prisons after executions. Guards claimed the right to violated corpses, particularly women convicted of crimes. Court records from Thebes describe cases where officials turned away as this happened. No law forbade it. The condemned had forfeited all rights with their crimes, including dignity in death. One papyrus notes a guard taking a widow's body after she was executed for theft, scribes recording it simply as fulfilling duties. What's chilling is how routine this became. Graffiti near Memphis boasts of executioners competing over who could claim the most attractive corpses. Priests preparing bodies for burial sometimes complained in mortuary texts about unclean handling before mummification began. They never specified details. They didn't need to. The system encouraged this. Executioners were often convicts themselves, spared death in exchange for performing executions. Their grim work isolated them from society, so authorities overlooked their excesses. A fragmentary prison decree warns new executioners against stealing the dead's jewelry, but says nothing about what they did to the bodies. Some victims were criminals, others were political prisoners. A noblewoman executed for treason during the New Kingdom was allegedly treated this way publicly, a final humiliation orchestrated by the pharaoh himself. Temple murals depict enemies of the state being trampled or burned after death, but the reality was often more intimate and degrading. Female prisoners suffered most. Papyrus trial records show women received harsher punishments for certain crimes than men. Adultery sometimes carried a death sentence for women, but only fines for men. Their bodies became sites of punishment twice over, first by the state, then by the executioners. Archaeologists have found evidence of this in unexpected places. Some female mummies show signs of damage inconsistent with normal mummification practices. One had pelvic fractures that wouldn't have occurred during life or execution, suggesting post-mortem violence. The practice persisted because it served a purpose. Beyond personal gratification, it reinforced a brutal hierarchy. If even death didn't free you from subjugation, what hope did the living have? Guards and officials understood this power dynamic perfectly. Modern historians often skip these details, focusing on grander injustices. But the silent screams here are louder than any monument. They remind us that in ancient Egypt, some punishments didn't end when the heart stopped beating. They simply entered a new phase of horror. No tombs were built for these victims, no prayers recited. Their suffering was meant to be invisible, another open secret in a society that polished its image while tolerating rot beneath. The executioner's privilege wasn't just about sex. It was about ensuring the powerless stayed that way forever. You walk through the crowded slave markets of Thebes, gold weighing down your purse as you browse. The auctioneer points out strong field workers and skilled weavers, but your gaze keeps drifting to the back stalls where younger slaves wait. Their contracts don't list agricultural skills or trades, just vague terms like household attendant or cupbearer. These were code words everyone understood. Legal scrolls forbid outright sexual slavery. but merchants and buyers found ways around it. A slave listed as a nighttime entertainer could be purchased without questions. Prices told the real story. Healthy adolescents with no apparent skills often sold for triple what laborers cost. Temple notaries approved these transactions, scribbling euphemisms that maintained plausible deniability. The system protected buyers, not the purchased. If a slave died under suspicious circumstances, owners simply claimed the child fell ill. Medical papyri describe injuries consistent with abuse, but courts rarely investigated. One fragmented court record mentions a merchant fined for killing a slave, not because it was murder, but because he damaged someone else's property. Some contracts included clauses guaranteeing refunds if slaves became unsuitable within a year. This usually meant reaching adulthood. Buyers would return older teenagers, demanding replacements while staying within the law. Merchants complied, recycling victims through multiple households until they aged out of the trade. Resistance was punished brutally. Runaway notices describe branded slaves, markings often placed on their faces. A rare surviving letter between nobles brags about breaking a slave's will through isolation and starvation. Archaeological finds support this. Several young mummies show signs of repeated fractures healed poorly, suggesting long-term captivity. Foreign children were particularly vulnerable. Captives from Nubia or Libya couldn't appeal to local kin for help. Their contracts often included clauses forbidding contact with others of their ethnicity, isolating them completely. Temple murals depict these slaves serving at banquets, their exotic features highlighted as part of the entertainment. What's chilling is how ordinary this was. Household inventories list young slaves alongside furniture and jewelry, their prices noted beside descriptions of physical attributes. Poetry from the period compares them to pets, beautiful when obedient, disposable when troublesome. The laws did nothing to stop this. In fact, they facilitated it by drawing false distinctions between respectable slavery and criminal abuse. As long as paperwork used the right terms, even the most horrific acts were just business transactions. Archaeologists occasionally find small graves near elite villas, unmarked pits containing young skeletons with ornate collars still around their necks. These weren't beloved pets buried with care. They were damaged goods discarded quietly. The final act in a system that turned children into commodities. No mourners attended. No curses were carved to protect their souls. Just silence where there should have been outrage. The market's secret wasn't really hidden. It thrived in plain sight, protected not by darkness but by the blinding glare of wealth and power. Everyone knew. Nobody stopped it. And that's perhaps the most disturbing truth of all. The embalming temple reeks of natron and myrrh as you prepare a noble woman's body for eternity. Then you notice the other priest's hands lingering too long, slipping beneath the linen wrappings. This wasn't part of the ritual. But in some shadowed corners of the mortuary cult, death wasn't always a boundary. It became an opportunity. Though Egyptian religion strictly forbade defiling corpses, records tell a different story. Embalming manuals include cryptic warnings against unclean contact with the dead, never detailing what that meant. Forensic examinations reveal disturbing clues. Certain female mummies show signs of pelvic damage inconsistent with normal mummification. The fractures appear too fresh, too deliberate. Some believed violating the dead granted power. A fragmentary curse tablet threatens to sexually abuse a rival's mummy to steal his strength. Mortuary texts whisper of rituals where necrophilia was disguised as resurrection magic. Claiming union with the deceased could transfer their chi, or life force. The gods Osiris and Isis set the precedent, with Isis reviving her murdered husband's body long enough to conceive Horus. But mortals twisted this myth into something darker. Tomb robber confessions occasionally surfaced in court records, detailing acts far worse than theft. One robber described breaking into a noble's tomb not for gold, but for his wife's preserved body. The punishment for tomb violations emphasized the gravity, slow impalement for trespassers caught in royal crypts. Yet the records imply some intruders felt the risk was worth it. High-status women faced special vulnerabilities. Queens and priestesses were mummified with extra care, their bodies treated as conduits of divine energy. But this reverence made them targets. Forensic scans of several noble women's mummies reveal internal packing inserted with unusual roughness, suggesting handlers took liberties during the 70-day mummification process. The practice persisted because fear of the dead fed it. Many believed the deceased could still feel pain or pleasure, making their violation doubly cruel. A demotic spell threatens to bind a ghost into eternal torment unless it obeys, proof that even in death, Egyptians saw vulnerability. Most damning are the omissions. Temple records meticulously document every ritual item placed in tombs, but say nothing about the nights when guards disappeared into crypts. Embalming recipes list exact measurements for resins, but omit why certain female corpses required extra wrappings. Modern CT scans now uncover what ancient scribes concealed. Some mummies' burial postures seem unnatural, hips tilted, limbs arranged suggestively. Museum collections worldwide likely hold victims of this silent violation, their true stories still wrapped in linen beneath display cases. The ultimate taboo wasn't just crossing the line between life and death. It was reducing venerated ancestors to objects of gratification, turning sacred preparation into sacrilege. For all Egypt's famed reverence for the dead, some saw only temptation waiting in the dark. The temple's inner sanctum reeks of sweat and burning herbs, as 18 initiates stand naked before the statue of Ammon, the devourer. She demands proof of devotion tonight. As high priest, you must guide initiates through rites that would shock even seasoned temple guards. This isn't the clean mythology of Osiris and Ma'at. These are the hidden cults where gods demanded flesh, not just faith. Fragmentary hymns describe rituals too explicit for public temples. One damaged papyrus details a ceremony where devotees of the warrior goddess Sekhmet had to copulate with strangers while chanting verses about destruction. Another mentions priests of the obscure god Nehebkau cutting themselves during orgies, letting blood mingle with semen as divine offering. The scraps that survive are heavily censored, with whole sections scraped away by later scribes. These acts weren't perversion, they were cosmology. The chaotic god Set required violent sex to maintain the cosmic balance, his followers reenacting his mythical rape of Horus. Initiates believed enduring degradation strengthened Ma'at, the universal order. The worse the act, the more power it held. A demotic text explains that semen and vaginal fluids contained Heka, magic essence, making their exchange sacrament. Participation wasn't optional. Temple records list punishments for initiates who refused, being buried alive in necropolis sands or sealed in coffins with rotting meat. The god's hunger justified everything. One Ptolemaic-era scroll describes a rite where priestesses of the lioness goddess Mafdet had to service temple guards during festivals, their compliance framed as taming the wildness of warriors. The rituals left marks. Medical papyri reference treatments for vaginal tearing and anal fissures among temple personnel. A healer's note prescribes opium for a priestess who couldn't walk after the feast of the dismemberment. None of this appeared in official histories. Temple murals show pristine ceremonies, never the blood-slicked floors where devotees crawled afterward. Upper initiates benefited most. High priests claimed the right to deflower novices as opening the way for divinity. A fragment from a disillusioned scribe complains how senior clergy always chose the most attractive acolytes for these honors. The system preyed on the devout. Poor families donated children to temples, hoping for advancement, not knowing what initiation truly required. Forensic evidence confirms the violence. Several mummies of young temple women show healed pelvic fractures consistent with extreme sexual trauma. One had bite marks preserved in the skin of her thighs, perhaps part of some forgotten ritual. Their golden amulets and fine linen wrappings couldn't conceal the damage. The god's darkest demands weren't about pleasure or even power, they were about control. By making devotees cross every boundary, the priesthood ensured absolute obedience. If you'd submit to this, you'd submit to anything. Broken initiates became the most fervent enforcers, Recruiting new victims to prove their own suffering meant something. Modern museums display temple artifacts with careful labels about fertility and rebirth. They never mention the cellar chambers where torchlight flickered on sweating bodies, or the way high priests invoked divinity while inflicting pain. Some truths stay buried, not in sand, but in silence. The golden statues and temple murals tell one story, but the cracks between hieroglyphs reveal another. Every civilization judges itself by its monuments, not its hidden rooms where the worst acts occurred. That duality should trouble us, not because ancient Egypt was uniquely cruel, but because it wasn't. History often polishes the past until it gleams. But real understanding requires examining both the light and the shadows. Those silent victims, enslaved children, abused priestesses, violated corpses, deserve more than erasure. So next time you see a pyramid, remember, what survives is what the powerful wanted preserved. The rest, we have to dig for it. If you found this revealing, seek other buried truths with us.